Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Chicago Justice Podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Siska. I'm also Executive Director of the Chicago Justice Project. You want to find out more about our work, chicagojustice.org. Want to get involved, cjpnation.org. And if you want to donate, the Patreon link will be down below. Support all the transparency and accountability work in the podcast itself. We'd really appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, please smash the subscribe, like this video, and ring the bell, and you'll get alerts every time we post. Today on the podcast, we talk to Raina Lipsitz, who is the author of The Rise of the New Left, How Young Radicals Are Shaping the Future of American Politics, published by Verso. Her works appeared in Al Jazeera, The Appeal, The Atlantic, The Nation, The New Republican, and many other publications, including The Crime Report, because she wrote a piece titled Breaking the Toxic Cycle of Fear Over Justice Reform. She was supposed to be on the pod towards the end of last summer, but with my family health issues and all of that playing out, that got delayed. We're so honored that she took time to sit down with us and talk to her about an article. Let's focus more on a national level, but it does apply to Chicago. We may have the earliest flip-flop in the history of Chicago politics. Brandon Johnson's spokesperson, or whoever that is, media person, has come out and said, about reopening all those mental health clinics that we said. Well, maybe we have to look around and, figure out the environment before any decisions are made. Could quite possibly be the quickest flip-flop in Chicago political history. Flip-flopping before they actually get sworn in. It looks like, at least with that comment, that we're going to be in the situation where we have another mayor of Chicago running to the left to get elected and then governing in the right center. Right? Center right, area of Chicago. So there we go. This may be, just another one. I mean, Daley said all these good things during the campaigns and then never delivered. So did Rahm. So did his dad, Jane Byrne. Harold wasn't around long enough to deliver, in my opinion, probably, but this is just how it's been. Lightfoot did it. She delivered on a few things, and she had the pandemic, understand, but God, on police reform, she was kind of a joke. She just kept throwing more and more money at them, including the secret $100 million raise that she gave them that is off the books that no one talks about, but we talked about it on our podcast earlier this season. So please enjoy the interview, and I will be back with you after it's over. Thanks. Raina Lipsitz, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So as I mentioned off air, we're talking about a piece that you wrote for the Crime Report, Breaking the Toxic Cycle of Fear Over Justice Reform. It was back in July 29th of 2022. Been meaning to have you on. We didn't get you on because I had some family health issues. But it's a really, really interesting piece. The link will be in the show notes. I suggest everyone please read it. And also go pick up her book, The Rise of the New Left, How Young Radicals Are Shaping the Future of American Politics. Came out last September. All right, so Raina, what drove you to write this piece?
I think what drove me to write the piece, I'd been thinking a lot about the New York mayoral race in 2021. I've lived in New York since 2005, so I consider myself a New Yorker, and that race was really interesting. I was pretty surprised and not entirely pleased when Eric Adams won it. He did not win with a majority, and it was a very crowded field, but he did win, and I think that told us a lot about what was happening both in New York and nationally in terms of this kind of panic over crime recurring. And the point of the piece is that it's sort of a cycle that we have in this country, and especially in large cities.
Yeah, it's a big piece, a big problem in Chicago. I did activists in police reform and justice reform work since around 1996 or so. Mm-hmm. And it is the cycle, which we'll get to later, that you talk about. It definitely happens in Chicago, and actually in Chicago, it happens on a yearly basis. It's almost on a seasonal cycle in Chicago. So let's bring up Eric Adams, You talk about aggressive tactics that he's like kind of like reverted to, or I think in the piece you say doubled down to. Can you give us an idea of what some of those tactics are?
Sure. I mean, he one of the first things he did was bring back solitary confinement to Rikers, and that had been a I think years long struggle by activists and by people who'd lost loved ones in prisons and jails in New York after a period where they'd been effectively tortured and isolated, and then in some cases driven to suicide. So there was a movement to end that practice, to ban solitary confinement. One of the first things Eric Adams did was bring it back. More recently than that, he's been extremely aggressive with unhoused people in New York, clearing homeless encampments, just really kind of brutally getting rid of people who've been living on the streets and destroying their homes and their communities. And then in November, he started talking about involuntary commitment of people struggling with mental illness, which is sort of a shocking thing to find ourselves back in that sort of period that I had thought was a historical period that we'd moved beyond, where you involuntarily commit people for not on suspicion of maybe being violent at some point, but not as a result of an actual violent act. So those are, I mean, some of the more shocking things he's done. I think in general, he's just very clearly been an ally to the police and to prison guards, and not so much to the people who are subject to the violence from police and prison guards.
It's interesting you bring up Rikers. I have just the smallest sliver of personal experience with it. So, God, back 18 years ago, 2005, I was an intern at the Vera Institute in New York, and their interns went on the summer intern tour of Rikers that the Department of Corrections in New York put on. So a couple of us tagged along. And in that, towards the end, we got to see what their solitary confinement. And they put us on the floor, and we were getting a tour from one of their commissioners. And someone asked, what do you have to do to get in? And besides like some certain levels of violence, he basically said a bunch of things that sounded like contempt of guard. Like not
Right.
making, not exactly following all the orders or something, just pissing off the guard. And later, after the tour was over, we had lunch with the head of Rikers. And one of the same intern from the Department of Bureau of Prisons or whatever violent things, he is like, no, no, no. He said all these things. That sounds like just making a guard mad. And the guy didn't know what to say. He just kind of sat there, and we moved on to other topics.
Yeah.
So to see us going back to that's pretty scary.
Yeah, it's pretty distressing, I think, especially to the people who've had family members who really suffered from being, I mean, various groups. I think Amnesty International and others have described this as a form of torture, and it is. I mean, it has long-term psychological impacts, and we know that from decades of research.
Yeah, it's treating the symptoms without like actually finding solutions.
Right.
All right, so in your piece, you talk about, and I want to quote from it, the cycles of reaction, reform, and backlash the proponents of large-scale structural change are dealing with. What are these cycles of reaction, reform, and backlash that you're talking about?
I mean, I think the first one I was conscious of was in the 90s when I was a teenager, and Bill Clinton was running on putting 100,000 more cops on the streets to deal with violent crime. So there's periodically, and I don't want to dismiss the idea that there are real crime surges. Sometimes that is a reality. Sometimes crime is going up in certain categories. Sometimes it's not, but it feels like it is. And there's sort of a right-wing media that feeds the narrative that it is. But whether it's perception or reality, sometimes there's a perception that crime is rising, sometimes it's actually rising, and the next thing you see are politicians running on, and this is true, of Democrats and Republicans, and I think the big lesson from the Clinton years was that you could sort of outmaneuver the Republicans by claiming this as your issue, right? That was the big sort of innovation of Bill Clinton's politically, to be like, I am in the law and order column, and you can't outflank me on that. And, that's what Eric Adams did essentially in 2021. He said, I'm a police officer. And in fact, he ran a police reform group for a number of years and was part of various reform efforts. So he had that kind of moral authority that he came with. And they say, we're going to clean up crime. People are scared. We're going to clean up crime. And then what happens is they introduce these really draconian measures that we know don't work from decades of seeing this play out. And then a few years later, sometimes they have to apologize a few years later. Joe Biden was called on by various people and groups in 2019 to apologize for his role in the 1994 crime bill. I don't think he really did, and it turned out not to be a liability for him because he won, he beat Trump by 7 million votes. So I think sometimes it's a political winner to do that, and then there's a period where people say, oh my gosh, actually that was bad, it didn't work, it made people miserable, it increased the prison population, and then we just sort of go back and do it all over again.
Yeah, that is definitely, I think that cycle exists. And in Chicago, it exists. Like I said, it does happen seasonally. Every year, you can talk about reform of the police and the justice system from like September to like April. Once May hits and violence goes up in May, June, July, and August, forget about it.
Right.
Right. Just like forget about it. Okay. What are your views on the reality of efforts to quote unquote defund the police? That's used against Democrats a lot, but like how successful has that actually been for the left?
Well, I think the movement itself is important, and shows the depth of the pain and anger that exists in a lot of communities and a lot of age categories. A lot of people have been working on this for a very long time, and really, really do want those resources shifted away from the police, which are overfunded in every major city, like seriously overfunded, while we're defunding preschools, we're defunding libraries, we're defunding really vital social services. So that's what people want. I think that's totally reasonable and fair, and I understand where that comes from. As a practical matter, it hasn't succeeded in the sense that we haven't really actually defunded almost any police departments, and a lot of cities where they vowed to do that. In fact, if you go back and see what actually happened, it didn't happen, right? In Minneapolis, they voted on it, a referendum, and the defund side lost. And in other places, the city council said, we're going to do this, we're going to, really move some money away. And then you look back a few months later and they've added the money back to the budget, or they've done something tricky with the budget where it looks like they took it away from one category, but they put it back in another place. You see this in New York City, where they did cut some money, but they put it back in other ways. And the police every year in New York City blow through their overtime budget, egregiously and with no consequence. And they just keep getting that money. Other parts of the city budget just don't work that way, right? You're not going to get more money in public schools if you just blow past your budget. That's not how it works. So I think it's, and I particularly resent, I say this in the article, that the left and young people and progressive Democrats have been blamed for, crime, as if there's we have actually defunded the police, which we haven't, and B, as if there's a proven link between defunding the police and crime going up, which there isn't. So I think those are the two things I would say about it, that it is an important movement. It's based on real outrage, real feelings of frustration that are valid. And it hasn't really worked because we haven't gotten the buy-in needed to really make those changes permanent.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've also found that in the left media, for the most part, also suffers from this fear of crime issue,
Mm-hmm.
and has all too often rushes to criticize the defund movement. I know TYT, the Young Turks, and others criticize some of the progressive prosecutors, which we'll talk about in a minute, and some of the mayors that have engaged whatever little they have on defund,
Mm-hmm.
because crime went up in 2020, as if, in my view, anyone with a brain who in 2019 was asked the question, hey, there's going to be a worldwide pandemic that kills 1 million Americans and millions more across the globe. And the worst parts of all of it are going to be felt on the most underserved communities of color in this country. And those are most often in urban areas. What do you think is going to happen to urban crime and violence?
Right.
Right? So I even the left media, I times, and I have a lot of problems with the Young Turks on crime and justice, they all too often push the blame on to progressive reforms rather than like, hey man, it's the pandemic. Okay, so let me ask you this.
And
Why do
overall
you,
social sorry, I don't mean
no,
to
go ahead.
interrupt,
Yeah, go
but
ahead.
yeah, exactly. It's the pandemic. I mean, a years-long pandemic that's still killing 1,000 Americans a week, and just sort of the collapse of everything else, right? The defunding of these major social services, which were briefly better funded during the pandemic out of necessity, and now we're taking those supports away again. You know, we're taking the child tax credit away. We're taking money away that people had become accustomed to and that were that was really helping families, right? And so now we're back in austerity budgeting, austerity policies. That's going to have downstream effects, obviously. And I just think there's a real unwillingness, there's a serious lack of political will to engage with the root causes of crime. We just keep doing the same Band-Aid stuff year after year and then being surprised when it doesn't work and it goes up and down. You know, the whole goal socially should be to permanently lower the crime rate and to allow people to live sort of happier, healthier lives in general. And that's not what we're doing.
right? Oh, 100%. I'm like, I think one of the few criminologists, I'm sure there are more that I just don't know of, that talk about when people bring up crime and violence reduction strategies, I always say poverty. Get out of my field, right? Get out of my lane right there. Let's just go to poverty. And they're like, oh, well, you know, you got to deal with all these other things, including racism, like you do. But the quickest thing to deal with is poverty. Government can just give people money.
Right.
The
And we saw
easiest
them
thing,
do that. Yeah.
right, exactly. But the easiest thing to deal with is poverty. We can deal with all the things after that. That's great. And I agree with that. There's a million reforms that have to be done. But that's just my take. And then this is why that voice is not as often quoted as in the media as I think it should be. Why are Democrats? I've always said, starting with Clinton, was the move national Democrats, and it's trickled down to mayors, and Mayor Lightfoot to some degree was one of those. Our mayor in Chicago recently. Mm-hmm. Democrats have moved so far right that for Republicans to distinguish themselves, they have to move further right.
Yes.
Which is an electorally. If it's just about power and winning elections, it's not a dumb move by the Democrats.
Or not always. It doesn't always work for them.
No,
but
it doesn't
yeah,
always,
yes.
but yes.
Sometimes it works. Yeah.
Right.
I agree.
I think that it's worked for them in a lot of places. In your opinion, is this purely about, for like the national level, when you talk about national level Democrats, is this purely just about electoral victories? That they keep committing down on these things, that they're pushing right, but also just recommitting the policies, like Eric Adams, like knowingly doing things that we have scientific evidence that fail.
I mean, I think Eric Adams is naturally a conservative person. I think those are his actual politics. I don't really think he's doing it cynically. I think he believes in that. I think you kind of have to keep getting promoted as a police officer, right? You have to buy into the system that you're a part of and the things that you're doing, the policies that you're promoting. I don't know. I think nationally, the biggest problem with the Democratic Party that I see is that they really, and it's for a lot of reasons, including the fact that the party itself is a big tent and includes people who have very, very dramatically different politics and beliefs and feelings about certain policies. But the National Party doesn't have a set of things that it definitively stands for, right? You could say, oh, the Democrats stand for abortion rights, and that's kind of true, although in my opinion, the National Party bears a lot of blame for allowing Roe to be overturned. But there's not a whole lot when you say, what does it mean to be a Democrat? I think people don't, there's not widespread agreement on what that means. There aren't like 3 things you can point to that all Democrats support and believe in. And that's particularly true on criminal justice issues, right? We just are not a united party on things like solitary confinement, involuntary commitment of homeless people. We're not united on housing policy. You know, there are these vast areas of sincere disagreement, and also the money in the party, the money that keeps the party going, is from major donors, many of whom are not big fans of progressive reforms, right? Because they stand to lose. They don't want their taxes to go up, and that's a big issue for the party. I think that's why I referred to it in my article as moribund, and it really, I mean, it's kind of hollowed out. There's not a whole, you meet, and no young people. I've interviewed many young people in the last 6 years, and none of them was like, oh, I'm so excited to be a Democrat. You know, they don't relate to this entity because it doesn't feel like it stands for anything. And they'll say different things depending on, you know, where they think public sentiment is. So that's why you see Joe Biden talking about reforms when it's a reform moment, and then a couple of years later saying, you know, I stand with the police and we need to crack down on crime or whatever. There's a lack of consistency.
Oh, 100%. I think they know, they certainly go towards the way the wind blows.
Right. Yes.
And I think something the National Party is going to have to deal with, and I know in Chicago, they're going to have to deal with the fact that the young people are not going to turn out for a centrist, right, unless the candidates are far right extremists.
Right.
It isn't about, for the Democrats, it isn't about losing the youth vote to Republicans. It's about losing the youth vote into them not voting.
To apathy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's right.
And that's just a bigger problem because the only way they're going to win is with the youth vote. Mm-hmm. Right. All right. So let's get to, what do you think? I know you talked a little bit about it in the article. What do you think Larry Krasner, the progressive prosecutor in Philadelphia, his reelection means for Democrats? What should they learn from it?
I mean, I think it's great news for not just for Democrats, but for the reform movement. I mean, I think Larry Krasner, you know, I know a lot more about New York politics than I do about Philly politics, but from what I've read and seen of him, part of what drives his success is that he is a naturally talented politician. He's just very good at talking to people and being relatable and explaining what he wants to do and why he's doing it. I think those are tremendous strengths, particularly in a field like politics. And he really ran as part of a movement. He shored up that support, and he works with other people, and he gives other people credit. I think that's something that's really striking about him, that when he talks, it's never about what I, Larry Krasner, am doing. It's about what he's doing with other people, with all of these people who have helped get him where he is. Now, a huge challenge for him and for Brandon Johnson in Chicago, for anybody running in sort of a progressive lane, is that, you know, no matter how mild your criticism is or your critique is of the police or of certain practices of the police they will fight back 10 times harder than you came at them, right? And we've seen, I mean, we saw that in New York with under Bill de Blasio. He had a tremendously hostile police department, and that's a real challenge for the left because that can undermine, particularly if you're in an executive office, it really undermines your ability to govern effectively if you have a whole group of people who are threatening to or just not going to do their job if they're angry at you. I mean, what's interesting in New York is that sometimes that has the opposite of the intended effect, right? So I believe it was 2015, the cops were pissed off at Bill de Blasio. They sort of did an unofficial work stoppage, work slowdown, crime went down. And people were sort of like, what did that prove? Except everything that we've been saying already, which is that if you stop enforcing low-level crime, you know, going after people for traffic violations, things are going to actually improve. And we did see that briefly then. I don't think it's always that neat. I don't think it's always going to work out in our favor in that way. But that's a real problem to figure out, is that tension between the police and the people who nominally control the police or employ the police.
Yeah, I remember that. I think that's happened a couple times in New York where they've tried these blue flu type of things.
Right.
And the city has went on running perfectly.
Right.
And then
Or
the
better.
police, or better, and then the police union is like, no, go back to work, go start making arrests again. They may
Right.
figure out that that's a lot of the low stuff that we do all day doesn't really make a difference.
Right, exactly.
So, just turning to Chicago a little bit. In Chicago, we have, on our last day, or last couple of days here, Mayor Lightfoot, first female black, first queer person, so female black lesbian, ran as somewhat of a progressive. She was probably had someone on the ticket more progressive than her when she was running, another black female who got caught up in kind of like a corruption, clout scandal. So Lori wins. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things she does, she ran as the progressive police reformer, is bring in interim superintendent. No, she doesn't. She keeps the superintendent about 10 months, has to fire him. Okay, bring in those 3 months between old school guy within the department that was running the CPD, Chicago Police Department, till she hires a dinosaur in March, a little after the pandemic starts, of 20. She brings in Charlie Beck from Los Angeles, a former chief of police there. And I'm sure Charlie is not without his issues, but he came in to massively reform the police department. And he came in under the agreement that I will come in, I have the credentials to get the rank and file on my side, and I will start cranking in these reforms. And then you're going to hire someone to replace me that will follow them through. That was the agreement as far as we know. And he started doing those reforms, getting rid of specialized units completely, and they've been a big problem in Chicago, lack of supervision. And when Charlie leaves, Mayor Lightfoot hires a dinosaur, a old school special unit, very manipulative around statistics, will lie right to your face, kind of cop. And I'm wondering, should we have expected that? Is this just what Democrats do?
I mean, yes, I think that's for a lot of them, especially the ones in executive positions, I think that they are under tremendous pressure, and that is often the pivot that they make. It's pretty rare, I think, for a Democrat to get into an executive office and then move left, right? They always end up tacking right when they get in. And I think that's for a lot of reasons, but they are under a lot of pressure from a lot of different constituencies. To me, though, that's not an excuse for that behavior. It's like you either are a person who, defends the lives and humanity of everyone in your city, or you're not. And I think in New York, what everybody's talking about now is what happened to Jordan Neely on the subway, and was choked to death by a fellow subway rider, an ex-Marine. that's not the same as a killing by a cop, because this guy was not an agent of the state, but it is related to that because, the more you treat people as if their lives mean nothing, the more that's going to happen. They're going to be treated by other people in the society as if their lives mean nothing. And I think that's what happened to Jordan Neely. And it's very hard to know what to do, because these people, once they get into office, are in a way no longer accountable to the people who put them there. They have at least a few years to make whatever decisions they want to make. Sometimes there are consequences to that. Sometimes they don't. I mean, Lori Lightfoot lost, right? But sometimes there aren't any consequences to that. And in the meantime, the decisions they make are affecting at least thousands of people, sometimes millions of people.
Yeah, and you can always count on a Democrat to disappoint you. That's my view of these things. And Mayor Lightfoot did something in Chicago that I kind of wrote her off pretty quick. I knew Lori. I know Lori. I haven't talked to her since she got in office. But this is really where I kind of wrote her off completely. And the hiring of David Brown was pretty much it. But this was the next thing, the big thing, and I want to get your comment on it. When the George Floyd protests hit Chicago, David Brown, the dinosaur she hired from Dallas, the superintendent, misread the intelligence that the county sheriffs and the state police had. They were all ready to come to Chicago and geared up, and the Chicago Police Department just ignored that. Didn't think protests were coming to Chicago. So they were caught off guard. It became evident pretty quick that these protesters had demands and they wanted reforms. And what Mayor Lightfoot said right away to defund was, she came out right away and said, absolutely not. We will not even entertain that discussion. And Chicago had protests continuing through the summer and violence. And I always thought, I was like, well, that's the end of me and Lori. That was it. But I also thought it strategically was incredibly dumb to not be like, you know what? Let's engage the city in this a year-long discussion. Even though it's the pandemic, let's do it virtually. Let's see what this would look like.
Right.
And we'll come out in a year with a report. We need to get these people off the streets and engaged in the system. She didn't do that. And I just want to get your thoughts to her knee-jerk reaction to just dismiss engaging the protesters at any level.
I mean, in a way, it's almost better than fake engaging with protesters, which I feel like is often what happens in New York, where there's a series of hearings or a series of pronouncements from City Hall, and that sort of talks in the language of Black Lives Matter and gives you some feeling that something is happening or that you're being listened to. But I think I say in the article, when you really look at what's happening in these cities with the budget, there's no shift in the actual overall numbers on police funding. There's a shift in rhetoric sometimes. So I guess it sort of depends on what you want from somebody. Sometimes it's better, I think, to know from the outset who your enemy is. And at least she told you up front, I don't care what you think. I don't care what the protesters think. I don't care what the people of the city want. This is what I'm doing. I don't know. I don't know if that's better or worse than somebody who says, I hear you, I feel your pain, I'm listening, I really care about this, and then just continues to do the same, make the same funding choices and give the same breaks to the police department.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. And my listeners may know this, and my viewers, but in Chicago, I think Lightfoot took it a step further in her first term, and she had talked about doing this. The police department needed a new police academy. The one they were using was dilapidated and not serving its purpose at any level, and restricting what training they could actually do. So she put $200 or $300 million, increased their budget to cover the construction of the police academy. But another thing is she created an office inside the mayor's office called public safety, and it was going to take over some responsibilities of the internal workings of the management of the CPD and the fire department. And an article came out, and it came out, but then it kind of dropped. And in the article, there was this wonky guy that did a report that basically showed that, yes, the mayor moved those responsibilities from the CPD to her office, to this public safety office in her office. It took away $100 million of responsibilities from the CPD, but she didn't move that money.
Right.
So she secretly gave the Chicago Police Department $100 million raise that no one's talking about. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, she's talking about not having money for all these other programs.
Right. Right.
It's so typical Democrat, it's ridiculous.
And I think one thing I've been thinking a lot about in New York is that the watchdog agencies that we have, or bodies that we have, like in New York, we have a civilian complaint review board. And just in 2022 alone, the board rejected over half of the disciplinary recommendations. I'm sorry, the police commissioner rejected over half of the board's disciplinary recommendations. So that means that, this board that ostensibly has oversight over the police or has some kind of mechanism by which to say we're going to hold these officers responsible because we find the complaints warranted after an investigation, and the police commissioner can just overrule them. And the police commissioner, well, who is the police commissioner? She was put there by Eric Adams. She's an ally of the mayor's. If the mayor seriously cared about this, he would say you have to abide by the disciplinary recommendations issued by the CCRB. He's of course not going to say that. There is no real mechanism within the CCRB to compel the police to accept its recommendations. And this is part of the problem, is that we have a lot of sort of fake or surface level bodies that are supposed to be keeping an eye on this stuff, and they don't, for a lot of reasons, partly because they were founded in a weakened form after a lot of opposition to making them really effective. But there's a lot of interesting stuff out there about the way these boards function. First of all, most cities don't have them at all, but the cities who do have them, they just simply don't work, and they've been effectively co-opted or neutralized by the police and by the mayors of those cities.
Yeah, in Chicago, my listeners probably know this but aren't going to be too happy with it. Chicago has one of the most sophisticated, multi-layered, complicated police accountability systems in the country with real discipline powers, and it still doesn't work. So
what's your theory? Why is that? Why doesn't it work there? It's just too complex.
It's incompetence, mostly incompetence. And we haven't really had the lack of will in their leaders, unfortunately. It's complicated, but yeah, it just doesn't work. And that's why, once again, we'll circle back to the beginning. If you can deal with poverty, you can empower those communities to fight back and resist. And by the way, poverty would reduce violence and crime significantly. And then you'd have a lot less of all of this.
Yeah, I agree.
In my opinion. So, okay. Raina Lipsitz, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me.
Once again, everyone, you can pick up her book, The Rise of the New Left, How Young Radicals Are Shaping the Future of American Politics. At Verso, came out last September. Please pick it up and go read the article. Breaking the toxic cycle of fear over justice reform. It's really interesting. It's at the Crime Report. All the links will be in the show notes. Thanks again. Really appreciate it, Raina.
Thank you so much.
Once again, I'd like to thank Raina for joining us. When you look at Chicago specifically, progressives put Johnson in office. That's who put him in office, right? Blacks and white progressives. There could be black progressives too, but it was blacks, some of the Latino vote, and white North Shore, right? North Shore progressives. Is he going to deliver on the reforms, especially the police reforms he's talked about? Who knows? Can deliver on police reform? Is he going to deliver on reallocation of some of the money? Don't know. He's talked about Johnson has talked about a lot about hiring all these new detectives. It probably can't have hurt that much to have a little more detectives, but the research in the 80s done by Wes Scogan, and I forgot who else was author of that book called Policing, basically showed back then that I think it was towards the late 80s it was published, early 90s maybe. Basically, it said for all the violent cases where there is not DNA, because it was the beginning of the DNA era, where there isn't a fingerprint that leads right to the suspect, where the victim or witness don't identify exactly who did it. Well, the police solved around 5% of the remaining. What did they solve? 5%. Is that good? No, I think Americans would be shocked to hear that figure. I think Americans would be shocked to know right now when those things happen. And this is part of the reason when you're getting drive-bys and things like that, it's a lot harder to solve. And you know what? The reality is police don't solve them. And really the only way they solve them is if they get a cooperating witness. They bust them on something else and they give them information. They're not really tracking the person down. Johnson's early flip-flop gives me pause. You look at Krasner in Philly, to some extent, Kim Fox in Chicago, to a large extent, Kim Fox in Chicago. If she didn't screw up that Smollett case, she'd probably still be in office or probably be running for another term a year from November. When you look at Lightfoot, yeah, she campaigned to the left and in aspects maybe the most progressive mayor Chicago's had, but is that really saying a lot? No, right? She was kind of a disaster. Remember, Mayor Lightfoot backed David Brown's firing within the last year of Albert Boyk, who's been a guest on the first season when we did the live shows. He was a guest, and he ran the Office of Constitutional Policing. And Lori backed that. He wanted 46 more cops to be assigned to the academy to keep up with the training requirements of the consent decree. What did David Brown do in response? He fired him. Lori backed it. Neither one really delivered on their promises related to policing. Lightfoot did run some trial programs related to crisis response, but she slow walked it as much as she thought she politically could, because I don't think she's really a backer of it. And summer's coming. It's going to be tough for Johnson, right? With the violence. He's somehow supposed to come into office early May and have a solution of violence already that's already started to tick up with summer. Will he fold? Most likely. We'll see. I hope not. But there's no indication in the history of Chicago to believe this shows us that we should have any faith in him not flip-flopping. Especially because the media and the alt-right are going to make such a big deal out of every crime incident and tie it to Johnson as if he's somehow the cause of crime from 3 or 4 weeks from now. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, pick up Raina's book, The Rise of the New Left, how young radicals are shaping the future of American politics at Verso. I'll try to put a link to the book in the show notes. So anyways, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. And we'll be talking next week.